Chapter 7, The Element of Surprise. As I sat at the big round table between my mom and dad, I felt like I was trapped in a sandwich. It was mealtime in the principal's office, and the main dish was sliced Nora. Mrs. Hackney loved big meetings. She always had. Almost every other week, she called an all-school assembly, or an all-fifth grade meeting, or an all-second grade meeting, or some kind of gathering of kids and teachers. She said it gave the school cohesiveness. She said it created good group dynamics for all of us to see each other's faces. And she said meeting as a large group helped us solve our problems all together, all at once. That was clearly what she had in mind today. Mrs. Hackney sat down and took charge. Since Mr. and Mrs. Rowley asked for all of you to be here, perhaps they should mention a few of the concerns they shared with me this morning. Then maybe Nora's teachers can explain things from their perspective. And if she wants to, Nora could share a little too. How does that sound? My mom nodded and smiled and cleared her throat. She was happy to talk first. Principals and teachers and counselors didn't frighten her one bit. She'd been trying to boss them around for ages, ever since the time she tried to push Anne into the gifted program 2 years early. My mom said, "We really appreciate all of you taking the time to come and talk. It's one of the things we've always loved about Philbrook schools. Our first concern today, apart from Nora's grades themselves, is that we had no warning that there was a problem. Not so much as a note or phone call. And we'd like to understand how that happened." Nobody said anything for about 3 seconds. Then Mrs. Byrne said, "I can only speak about Nora's grades and library skills, of course, but it's pretty clear what happened." Mrs. Byrne had her grade book open on the table in front of her. So did all my other teachers. My heart was pounding so hard that I was sure my mom and dad could hear it. Mrs. Byrne ran her index finger along a row of numbers. On the first 3 quizzes and our first reference search, Nora got scores that averaged out to about 72%, which is a low C. And that's why at the 7th week of the term, that's when we mail out academic warnings to parents. And since Nora didn't have a D or lower, there was no warning. Then on the next quiz and our final internet research project, Nora did quite poorly, and that pulled her grade down. I entered her scores, calculated the average, and there it was. Mrs. Byrne looked at me and smiled. "Nora is one of the library's very best customers, so I didn't like having to give her a D, but that's the way it happened." Mrs. Zhang nodded. "Exactly," she said. "Numbers are numbers, and an average is an average." Same thing in science and math classes for Nora. Her grades dropped off right at the end of the term, and that was it. No warning for you, no warning for me. All my other teachers started nodding and agreeing. Mr. McKay cleared his throat and said, "Ditto in gym class. C's all term, then a big fat F on the obstacle course fitness challenge. Dropped her to a D." I could tell my dad did not like it when Mr. McKay said big fat F, but I sort of enjoyed it. I was proud of that F. I was probably the only kid in the history of the school to fail the obstacle course fitness challenge. It took a lot of creativity to look completely uncoordinated and totally out of shape. Dr. Trindler said, "I'd like to make an observation." He was the guidance counselor. He was also the psychologist for the school district. He opened a big folder and started shuffling paper around. I knew what that folder was. It was the Nora Rowley folder, all records from my past 5 years at the Philbrook Elementary School. As he looked at the papers on the table, Mr. Trindler put the palms of his hands together and then flexed them apart, so only the tips of his long, thin fingers were touching. Apart, together, apart, together. It made his hands look like a spider doing push-ups on a mirror. He adjusted his glasses and then tried to smile at my parents. He didn't look at me. Mr. and Mrs. Rowley, I know this sort of report card can be upsetting, but honestly, grades like this aren't that far out of line with Nora's mastery testing profile, or with her academic history here at the elementary school. The Philbrook school system has very high standards. Nora's been an average student, right there in the middle, with room to move either way. And sometimes grades can get tipped downward instead of upward. That's all. And sometimes performance can be related to all sorts of things, like unusual stresses at home, like losing a job or perhaps a death in the family. Sometimes even little disturbances can make a big difference. Right away, my dad leaned forward and said, "Are you pushing this problem back at me? Is that what you're doing? We're not talking about my job or our family life here. You people handed out almost a dozen D's, and you didn't even know what each other was doing. No one stepped up to help a kid who clearly needed some help, who needed some. And now it's all my fault? I don't like the sound of that. Not at all." Mrs. Hackney said, "I'm sure Dr. Trindler didn't mean to make it sound like this was anyone's fault, Mr. Rowley. We're certainly not trying to assign any blame here. We just want to understand what happened so we can make the right adjustments." My dad didn't sit back, and Mrs. Hackney didn't want to ask him if he had more to say because he probably did. So she kept on talking and said, "Well, one person we haven't heard from yet is Nora." Then looking at me, Mrs. Hackney smiled and said, "Nora, is there anything you can tell us that would help us understand what happened at the end of the grading term?"